Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Welcome, friend. I had a feeling you'd be by tonight. No, it's not some kind of ESP or anything. It's kind of our thing. Friday night at Drew's. And not once has anyone brought you a cookie, Chester. So why is it that you never stop begging? He's a slow learner. Well, come on in, friend. I'm supposed to be your host, right? Might as well try to be a good one. All right, that's better. So tonight we thank Velox Books for introducing us to author Thomas O., a Reddit sensation, so I hear. So let's smoke 'em if you got 'em and drink those glasses to the bottom, y'all. 'Cause old Drew Blood has a tale to tell. But first the rigmarole, Leo.
Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. You know, Drew Blood's Dark Tales is only one of the many shows on this network you could be listening to. We hope you'll subscribe to our entire lineup, including Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, Scary Stories Told in the Dark, Fear from the Heartland, and Horror Hill. All available on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. Also, visit simplyscarypodcast.com to become a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you get our entire catalog ad-free and available to download or stream. A bargain. And now, back to the show.
Tonight's tale takes place between a small team of surveyors on a distant planet. As it happens with most threesomes, shit gets weird. So without further delay, from author Thomas O., I give you Jasperson's Game. The planetary survey was expected to take 9 months. The surveyors, all carefully selected by the company, would be on their own for the entire duration. Their goal was to locate valuable deposits on the unexplored planet and hopefully make money for their employer. A mobile construction crew had landed on the planet a week earlier to assemble their habitat and had already moved on to the next planet by the time the surveyors arrived. Their dropship, the Stardust, was a small transport vessel manned by a captain and 2 crew members. The captain, Yasmala Teg, had been traveling through the near-lawless reaches of that sector for several years, transporting all sorts of surveyors to and from their destinations. Edward Ginbrowser was her frequent passenger, and the one whom she was most fond of. She had transported him to his last 5 surveys and had grown to understand his subtle humor and sly wit as much as anyone could. Despite his often distant demeanor, the 2 of them had formed a romantic relationship. He was quite the enigma to her, a man who seemed to prefer his relationships in small doses, who always helped keep her bed warm. Though he never let her get too close, she took solace in her knowledge that the gentleman could never hurt her.
I suppose he thinks our relationship is perfect as is,
she thought to herself as Ginbrowser slowly woke next to her. She looked out the window at the planet below while the man yawned and stretched out his arms. After a 5-day journey, they had reached their destination. The planet she found herself staring at was Earth-like in some ways, in that the length of a day and its gravitational force were nearly identical to that of home. There were striking differences, though, most notably the very thin and poisonous atmosphere. Viewed from space, the surveyors and the crew seemed to think the surface looked like someone had swirled ketchup and mustard together. The company didn't have high hopes for the planet. In fact, hope was so limited that they hadn't even bothered to name it, only giving it the designation of P12-348. It was a lifeless and desolate place, Still, they felt it merited at least a cursory look, so a minimal crew of 3 surveyors was given the assignment. Upon touching down, Captain Tegg took her time making sure the surveyors were settled into their simple yet sturdy habitat. The company certainly hadn't overspent on the lodgings, but the basic structure would serve its purpose, and it provided each man with his own quarters. Once it was clear that the habitat was in perfect working order, she promised to return for them in 9 months. As she went to board her ship, she made eye contact with Jasperson one last time. He smiled at her and winked, but didn't speak. She nodded and disappeared into the ship. Soon the men were alone. Between the 3 of them, there was no official leader, which was common for such a small crew. Per company policy, they were all carefully screened to make sure they had the correct personalities for their mission. There were no egoists among any of the survey teams. They were level-headed, kind, and curious, perhaps even a little boring. They were expected to get along well enough and avoid squabbles. Decisions would be made by committee, and in the rare event that the team members disagreed on something, compromise was expected. This formula had worked well for the company, and there was no reason to expect anything different this time. Of the 3, Jasperson was the longest serving, already having worked on 6 previous surveys. He considered himself the smartest of the 3, and he knew that most of the technical chores would fall to him. Jed Collins was the second longest serving member with 4 planetary surveys to his name, 3 of which had been served alongside Jasperson. The last member was someone new, Benedict Jasperson, a man on his first planetary survey. In Jasperson's assessment, Jasperson didn't appear to be among the smartest of the surveyors he had served with, not by a long shot. His size and strength would be his contribution. On paper, all 3 members were interchangeable with one another. Each one was trained in and expected to be able to perform every task, but in practice, team members were often specialized in their duties. As Jasperson saw it, most of the heavy lifting and physical chores would be done by Jasperson. Collins would be the in-between guy, sometimes filling in on technical duties and sometimes doing the physical work. It was no mistake that these 3 were assigned to work together. In many ways, they complemented each other well. The first 4 days went as expected. Jasperson uplinked the computers to the satellites that had been left in orbit by Stardust. He fed them instructions and plotted the most promising courses for them. They would map the planet's surface and subsurface as well. Jasperson spent his days in the runabout, exploring the planet's valleys and peaks in person. Even with all the technology available, there was still no substitute for getting outside and surveying with one's own eyes. Collins went about setting up the analyzers, replicators, and other various machines. It wasn't long, though, until Jasperson really began to stand out. His personality was unlike any of the other surveyors Jasperson had ever worked with. He was friendly, amiable, and talkative. That's not to say that the others hadn't been nice, but there was a distinct and noticeable difference. Jasperson made it a point to ask the other men about themselves, about their families, and about their dreams for the future. He was always smiling, and his big lumbering form made him look like a proverbial gentle giant. When he wasn't working or regaling the other men with his stories, he spent his time writing in his old-style handwritten journal. It was a very curious attribute, Jasperson thought, to journal in such a primitive way. Jasperson wrote in it every night, and though Jasperson and Collins both thought it to be an odd habit, neither of the men bothered to ask him what he was writing about. Day 5. After all of the equipment had finally been set up and calibrated, and a rudimentary map of the surface had been completed, it was Jasperson who broke out with a bottle of whiskey and encouraged the other men to celebrate their accomplishment. Consumption of alcohol was against company policy, but Jasperson had snuck it onto the planet nonetheless. "Time to celebrate, boys," he told them. Jasperson considered the offer. He really had no need for that type of fraternization with his colleagues, but at the same time, he was growing fond of the dumb, hard-working giant who was in front of him holding the bottle. He agreed to one drink. Collins was game too, so that night the three men sat down in the common room and shared the bottle. Ginbrowser, as it turned out, ended up taking far more than one drink. As the bottle emptied and the whiskey had its way with the men, the conversation flowed. Looking at Jasperson, Ginbrowser spoke in slightly slurred words. "Tell me, Jasperson, why are you so nice? You're just so talkative." He took a drink, then slammed down the glass. "I guess nobody told you you wouldn't fit in with this company." "It's just how I am, Jen," Jasperson replied with a smile. "It's how I've always been." "Bullshit!" Ginbrowser shouted louder than he intended. "Come on, nobody who chooses to work in deep space is that nice. Tell us, what are your secrets? You gotta have something. Come on, Jazz, confession is good for the soul." Collins nodded in agreement. Jasperson took the bottle to his lips and, tossing his head all the way back, finished it. "Looks like we're done here, fellas." He smiled mischievously. The three men laughed, but soon a silence settled over the room. With the alcohol making their eyelids heavy, Ginbrowser and Collins began to doze off, not even making the effort to find the way to their personal quarters. Despite the fact that he had consumed over half the bottle, Jasperson seemed less affected than the others. Once they passed out, he wrote in his journal. Then he too closed his eyes for the night, sleeping in the common room with the other two men. A couple of hours later, Ginbrowser woke up. He stumbled to the bathroom to relieve himself, then slowly wandered back to where the other two men were sleeping. He noticed that Jasperson, who was spread out on the couch, had his journal lying across his chest. Normally, Ginbrowser respected everyone's privacy, but still a little drunk, he couldn't help but wonder what kinds of things Jasperson had written down. Who was this enigma lying before him? "This guy just doesn't fit in here," Ginbrowser thought as he slowly lifted the journal from Jasperson's chest. Sitting down, he began flipping through the pages, his eyes taking longer than usual to focus on the writing. With the room spinning around him, he was only able to read bits and pieces, but what he saw concerned him. "I'm so bored. I really need some excitement around here. Can't stand it. Gonna snap soon. I'm really trying. It's just so dull. Ginbrowser is nice but boring. Collins is so bland." Ginbrowser was confused. How could Jasperson have possibly made it past the company's psychological screening process? Someone like him, who got bored after 5 days, should have been flagged well before he was ever sent on a survey. Still, at that moment, he was too tired and too drunk to give it much more thought. He carefully closed the journal and gently placed it back on Jasperson's chest. Jasperson snored peacefully. Ginbrowser walked slowly to his quarters and passed out for the rest of the night on his bed. Day 6. The morning was a blur for Ginbrowser. He awoke hungover and grumpy, and Collins didn't look too much better. Still, the company wasn't paying them to sit around nursing their hangovers. The work had to continue. The three men decided that Jasperson and Collins would take the runabout to a distant outcropping that showed some promise. Together, they'd use a drill to check several hundred meters below the surface. Ginbrowser was thankful for the opportunity to stay back and analyze the satellite feeds, and he closed himself in the upstairs tech room with the lights low. Jasperson and Collins entered the airlock and loaded the runabout with their equipment. They double-checked the integrity of their exploration suits and then shut the door between the habitat and the airlock. Once the airlock depressurized, they opened the outside door and headed toward their destination. From the tech room on the second level, Ginbrowser watched out the window as they slowly disappeared. Jasperson could still be heard cracking jokes over the radio, and Jinbrowser soon turned the volume down so he could concentrate. An eerie calm fell over the habitat, and Jinbrowser became lost in his work. The two men were expected to be gone 8 hours, so Jinbrowser was surprised when only 4 hours later he saw the runabout come flying back over the horizon. "Why are they moving so fast?" he wondered. Jinbrowser reached over and turned up the volume on the communicator, and Jasperson's desperate voice came through. "Jin! Jin! Can you hear me?" Jinbrowser responded to the call. "Yeah! What's wrong?" "Meet me in the airlock. Collins. He's dead, man. He's dead." Jinbrowser bolted upright in his seat, then ran down the stairs toward the airlock. He watched through the window as Jasperson skillfully maneuvered the runabout inside. In the back of the vehicle, he could see Collins' bloody body. His protective suit was torn open, and his helmet was cracked. The outside door closed, and Jinbrowser waited several agonizing minutes as the airlock pressurized. When it was safe, Jinbrowser opened the inside door and ran to the runabout. Looking closely at the body, he could see that Collins' head had been cracked open. By what, he didn't know. Jasperson spoke first. "A boulder landed on top of him. I couldn't stop it." His voice was shaken. Then he addressed Collins as if he was still alive. "Oh man, Collins. I'm so sorry." Jinbrowser looked at the body of his friend. Collins had been a good man, and he deserved a better fate than having some rock land on his head. Jinbrowser had always enjoyed working with Collins. He had been reliable and friendly, and he even had a good sense of humor once someone got to know him. They cleaned the body as best they could and placed it in a new exploration suit. Per company policy, the body was stored outside, a short distance from the habitat. It would be retrieved when the dropship returned. Jasperson explained that Collins had set up the drill under an outcropping of rocks. When the drill started, the whole area shook, and a large boulder came loose. Jasperson saw it fall, but couldn't warn Collins in time. Jinbrowser cursed at his dead friend for being so careless. That evening, Jinbrowser used the long-range communicator to send a message to the company. Collins, ID number 2545-49, deceased. The brief message didn't seem like a proper way to pay tribute to his friend, but the communicator required an extraordinary amount of power, and even a small message could nearly deplete the battery banks, which would then take several days to fully recharge. The message would reach the company headquarters in a few days. If they followed standard procedure, they would eventually send a replacement for Collins, but he had no idea how long that would take. He couldn't imagine that this expedition, with its unpromising nature and remote location, would rank too high on their list of priorities. The next few days passed uneventfully. Jasperson continued with his amiable ways, seemingly unaffected by the death of his co-worker. Every night he wrote in his journal, and Jinbrowser could hear the loud strokes as they swept across the paper. Both men worked extra hours to make up for the loss of their companion, but Jinbrowser managed a few moments to reflect on his situation. He still wasn't sure how someone with Jasperson's personality wound up on their mission. What the hell was he writing about every night? And the question that bothered him most of all, why would Collins, a man with years of experience, make the rookie mistake of setting up a drill beneath an outcropping? Day 9. Even though it was unlike Jinbrowser to become nosy and meddlesome, there was nothing typical about the survey that was unfolding around him. With that thought, he finally allowed his curiosity to get the better of him. While Jasperson was out in the runabout, Jinbrowser stepped carefully into his room and spotted the giant man's journal on the bedside table. Picking it up, he perused through the pages until he landed on the entry from day 6, apparently written shortly after Collins had died. His mouth dropped when he saw it. It wasn't a typical journal entry. It was a letter written to him.
Hi, Jen. I was awake last night when you read my journal. You thought I was asleep. You were wrong. It's okay, I'm not mad. In fact, I think it presents me with a unique opportunity since I figure there's a 50-50 chance you'll try and read my journal again at some point. Remember what you said to me, that confession is good for the soul? Well, I've been thinking about that, and I've come to believe that you are probably right. So here it is. I killed Collins, and it was fun. It was just a sudden urge that I tried to resist, but once I gave in, I can't even begin to describe how much I enjoyed it. I know you've never killed anyone, but you should really try it. It's the best feeling in the world. And despite what you're probably thinking right now, I bet you would really get off on it. Just bringing that rock down on his head again and again made me so happy. It was only afterward, seeing how it affected you, that I began to feel bad. But I'm already starting to feel better just writing this down. It's like a burden has been lifted off of me. I'm even smiling as I write this. So, what do we do now, Jen? I'll tell you what we do. You put this journal down and you pretend like you never read it. Beautiful, right? I get to confess, and you get to live. And just so we're clear, if I find out that you know my secret, I'll have to kill you too. But I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, Jen, and I'm going to assume that you're not actually reading this. You're the only friend I have right now. So let's keep it that way.
Jen Browser read the passage several times, absorbing its contents as a sense of dread overcame him. There were no other notes to him in the rest of the journal. This has to be a joke, he thought, but in his gut he knew the truth. With his hands shaking, he carefully placed the journal back on the table, leaving it in the position he found it in. A million thoughts raced through his mind. He'll never let me off this planet alive. He's just playing with me. I don't want to die. I should have told Yasmila I love her. A few minutes later, the sound of the approaching runabout filled the habitat. Chinbraza resolved himself to act normally. He looked himself over in the bathroom mirror and used his hands to straighten his clothing. He took a deep breath. After clearing the airlock, Jasperson entered the common area.
Hey, Jen. Man, I gotta tell you, there's nothing out there but common rocks.
Jim Browser nodded his head in agreement and forced a little laugh. He could feel a small bead of sweat forming on his forehead. Jasperson sat on the couch and put his feet up.
I'm gonna sleep good tonight. You should really get out of the habitat more, Jen. You'll sleep so much better if you're physically active.
Jen Browser nodded again. Jasperson looked at him closely.
You okay, Jen?
Jen Browser nodded.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Collins. I miss him.
The smile fell from Jasperson's face. For several moments he stared straight at Jen Browser.
Yeah, right, Collins. I almost forgot about him.
Suddenly his voice became animated.
But hey, if you miss him, he's right out there.
Jasperson let out a laugh and pointed out the window to a small bump just a short distance from the habitat. Jen Browser didn't know how to respond and simply looked at the floor. Jasperson stopped laughing.
Sorry, Jen. That was a shitty joke.
That's okay. I think I'm going to go to sleep now. Jen Browser walked to his bedroom as Jasperson protested behind him.
Hey, stay up a little while and play a game with me.
A thought, one he couldn't verbalize, popped into Jen Browser's head. We're already playing a game, you stupid bastard. Day 13. Jin Browser had lived in terror for days, constantly having to remind himself to act as if he didn't know that he was living with a vicious killer. Forced smiles, meaningless pleasantries, casual conversations, they all became harrowing chores for him. He toyed with the idea that he should sneak up on Jasperson and attack him and hopefully incapacitate him with a single blow. But the truth was that Jin Browser was too much of a coward to do so. Jasperson outweighed him by at least 45 kilos, and Jin Browser knew he would stand very little chance in an outright brawl, even if he went with a surprise attack. Still, it was an option that he kept under consideration, mostly because he knew that most likely Jasperson would eventually have to kill him no matter what. It would simply be too much of a risk for Jasperson to let him off of the planet alive. He decided for the time being to go along with Jasperson's game until he could think of a better plan. One idea he had already discarded was sending a message to the company and telling them about Jasperson's murderous ways. Too risky, he thought. Jasperson would most likely notice the drop in battery power and become suspicious. Regardless, the company would already be sending out a ship. Day 14. Jin Browser awoke to find Jasperson standing next to his bed.
Good morning, Jin Browser,
Jasperson said in a monotone voice. Jin Browser shot up.
What are you doing in here?
The fear in his voice was obvious.
Relax, my friend.
Jasperson's voice was strangely calm and slow. Then, without answering Jin Browser's question, he continued.
I'm going to take the runabout to check out another spot on the Western Plains. It'll be a long day for me.
Jin Browser nodded his understanding. Jasperson turned and left the room, and with his voice suddenly regaining its natural charm, he yelled over his shoulder.
See you tonight, Jin.
Jin Browser stayed in bed until he heard the airlock open and the runabout speed away. He got up and forced himself to eat breakfast, even though his stomach felt like it was tied in knots. As he walked past Jasperson's open bedroom, he glanced inside and saw the journal. It had been placed on the nightstand and balanced upright so that it was standing on its edge. Its white cover stood out in the darkened room. Jasperson had never left his journal in such a position before. It was there to draw his attention. Jin Browser knew it. For an hour, Jin Browser argued with himself about whether he should read the journal or not. The strange combination of fear and curiosity swirled in his mind. He didn't want to play Jasperson's game anymore, but he knew he was already sucked in whether he read it or not. Finally, he darted over to the journal and picked it up. He flipped it open and found another page addressed to him.
Hi, Jin. Did you read my journal the other day? When I got back, it seemed like you were trying to hide something. I considered killing you right there on the spot. I'm glad I didn't, because right now you're my only friend, and I hate when I have to kill my friends. For now, I'm just going to assume that you didn't read it. I know you're probably still shaken up over the whole Collins mess, so that's what's got you acting all weird, right? Please, if you're reading this, don't let me know. It's quite therapeutic for me to unload all of this on you, but I can't take the chance that I'm really and truly letting you peek into my mind. Jin, I want you to know that I never wanted any of this to happen. I came out here with every intention of working hard and being good, but even more so, I needed to get far away from some people who were coming to realize the type of person I really am. Do you know how hard it was for me to get past a psych evaluation? I had to let that bitch of a psychologist probe my mind. I thought I had her fooled, but she was very good. She seemed to know I wasn't right for this type of work. She's actually the one who suggested I start writing my thoughts down in a journal. She said it would help keep my mind occupied when I got bored. I never got the chance to tell her it worked, because I killed her once I realized she was going to deny my application. It's too bad. She was stunning. She dressed sharp and she wore some great jewelry. In fact, I have a diamond ring of hers in my drawer. It's beautiful. You should really look at it when you get the chance.
There was still more to read, but Jasperson paused at that point. He remembered hearing about the disappearance of one of the company's psychologists a couple of months earlier. Nobody had a clue about what had happened to her. He looked down at the nightstand in its unlocked drawer. Slowly and methodically, he lowered his hand and opened it. Inside, he found only one thing, a sealed plastic bag. Inside the bag was a diamond ring. And the diamond ring? It was still being worn by a dried, severed finger. Jasperson gasped and dropped the bag to the floor. His breathing increased as he looked around to make sure he was still alone. He was. Collecting himself, he reached down, retrieved the bag from the floor, and placed it carefully back inside the drawer. He closed it and went back to the journal.
The next psychologist liked me quite a bit more. She was easy to manipulate. She never even knew who was really in charge. She gave me a terrific recommendation, and she was a great lay, too. So here I am, out here far away where my past can't catch up to me so easily. And I want you to know, Jen, I'm trying. I want to be good, but sometimes that's just so boring.
Jasperson carefully placed the journal back in the position he had found it. Then he did the only thing he could do. He tried his best to forget what he had just read and got to work. Jasperson made his way back to the habitat toward the end of the day. His loud, amiable voice boomed through the room.
I tell you, Jen, there's nothing valuable out there at all. The company didn't have too much hope for this stupid rock, and they were right.
Jasperson nodded his head and reminded himself to act normal. Jasperson continued.
You know how lucky you are. You get to sit in here all day, not really lifting a finger. It's okay, though. I really like flying around in that runabout.
Jasperson's ears perked up. Maybe he had imagined it, but there had been a very slight emphasis when Jasperson spoke the word finger. He suddenly felt nauseous.
I think I need to lie down. I don't feel so well.
Jasperson's wide smile instantly fell from his face, only to be replaced by a serious look that spread across his visage.
Is that so?
Yeah, I just need a nap. Jasperson stared intently for several seconds, then his smile instantly returned.
Okay, you go lay down. By the way, there's another outcropping out to the east that I'm going to go check out tomorrow. I'll probably leave early, so I'll see you when I get back.
Jasperson mumbled his assent and headed to his quarters. Day 15. Jasperson awoke alone in the habitat. As he walked into the common area, he glanced into Jasperson's quarters, almost as a reflex. The first thing he noticed was that the journal was once again left out in the open. It was lying on top of the crisply made bed. The diamond ring, sans the finger, was placed on top of it. Jasperson was becoming more and more emboldened with this game of his, and Jasperson wondered how much longer it would be before he was killed. Jasperson glared at the journal. He wanted to destroy it. He wanted to read it. In the end, he left it in its place.
I'm done with this, Jasperson,
he muttered under his breath. He went to the tech room and began his work for the day, though he wondered if there was any point in doing so. Slowly, he started focusing on the screens in front of him. It wasn't until late afternoon that he noticed something was amiss on the computer. The logs recorded that an incoming message had been received 5 days earlier, but when he went to look for the message itself, it was missing entirely. It had been erased. Someone from the outside, probably the company, had contacted them. Whatever they said, Jasperson didn't want him to see it. He thought back to the journal. Was it possible that there would be some mention of the deleted message somewhere within its pages? Despite having the opportunity to do so, he had yet to thoroughly go through all of the journal's entries. He cursed Jasperson for his actions, and then half-heartedly walked down the stairs and into the other man's quarters. He carefully moved the ring from atop the journal and placed it on the bed. He flipped through it, looking to see if the information he sought was in there. There was no mention of the deleted message, but on the last page he found another note addressed to him.
Hello, Jen. Things have been a little boring here lately, haven't they? So with that, I have a little challenge for you. And I think it will be fun for both of us. Here it is. When I get back later, I'm going to say something completely innocuous. Just a little meaningless phrase. Let's go with, the sky is beautiful today. When I say that, can you act as if it's just a pointless bit of banter? Or will you start to stutter and sweat? Will your eyes look away from me as you try your best to pretend that I haven't just triggered your survival instinct? Will the tone of your voice change as you try your best to swallow the bile and fear coming up from your throat? We'll find out. Let's see how normal you can act when you know every subtle nuance is being studied. That is, of course, assuming you've actually read this. If you haven't, then you'll have no discernible reaction, and no problems. Last thing, Jen, regardless of what happens, it's been fun knowing you. I honestly did want this new life to work out. I guess my biggest failing is my inability to change who I really am.
Jinbrowser flung the journal across the room in anger. It hit the wall and bent at the corner. Jasperson's challenge seemed simple enough on the surface. Don't stutter, don't sweat, don't hesitate, don't answer too fast, don't blink. Just respond normally when he mentions the beautiful sky. But Jinbrowser knew his nerves would make it much more difficult than that, especially if Jasperson really was as observant as he seemed to think he was. Finally, his emotions took over. He ran over to where the journal had fallen to the floor and stomped on it. Fear and anger fueled him as he picked the book up and beat it against the wall. He collapsed on Jasperson's bed for a minute. He knew he was as good as dead. He stormed back up to the tech room, determined to send a message to the company telling them that Jasperson was a murderer. The game was ending, so it no longer mattered if Jasperson knew he sent the message or not. It wouldn't help him personally, but at least it might make it so Jasperson would one day have to answer for his crimes. He turned on the long-range communicator and instantly saw blinking red lights.
Shit!
Jinbrowser yelled as he suddenly realized that the communicator wasn't functioning. He removed the cover and saw that some of the internal workings had been removed.
That son of a bitch!
He screamed out. Out the window, he could see Jasperson's runabout returning to the habitat. A trail of red dust was kicked up in its wake. Jinbrowser felt a moment of desperation. He had no place to hide, and he couldn't possibly outmuscle Jasperson. He looked along the wall of the tech room where he saw the protective exploration suits hanging. His only chance of survival would be to leave the habitat. Even with a suit on, he wouldn't survive more than a day, but it would give him time to hopefully think of a plan to defeat Jasperson. He quickly began putting the suit on. Its batteries were at full power, which meant 20 hours of air for him. If he could manage to get into the runabout, that would provide him with even more life support. He knew that it would be impossible for him to move quietly with the suit on. He would have to wait for Jasperson to go to his quarters, then run out as fast as he could. He could hear the outer airlock doors opening, and then the runabout slowly moved to the inside. The airlock filled with air again, and the inner door opened. Jinbraza remained upstairs in the tech room, standing as still as possible. He could hear Jasperson's voice from downstairs. It was as cheerful as ever.
Hey, Jin, look at this rock sample I found. I don't think it has much value, but it's got some interesting patterns you should look at.
Jinbraza heard Jasperson walk toward his quarters. If he hadn't seen that his journal had been damaged, he would notice it in the next few seconds. He heard a mighty thump come from the downstairs area, as if a large object had been dropped. The heavy footsteps left Jasperson's quarters and quickly moved towards Jinbraza's room. Jinbraza knew he only had a few seconds before the maniac would check for him upstairs. He bolted down the flight as quickly as the suit would allow him. As he ran into the common area, he noticed a heavy yellow rock that had been dropped by Jasperson. It was the size of his head. He glanced at it only a moment and then kept running, unsure if Jasperson was following him or not. Behind him, Jasperson's loud voice rang out from the other side of the room.
Hey!
Jinbraza stopped just shy of the airlock door.
The sky is beautiful today, isn't it?
Jasperson's voice was eerily monotone. Jinbraza didn't speak, and he refused to turn around. Jasperson spoke up again.
I said, the sky. It's beautiful today. Don't you think?
He gave a slight chuckle. There was only dead silence in the habitat. To Jinbraza, the quietness seemed to last for a minute, though it was probably only for a few seconds. The complete absence of sound was eventually broken by the methodical footsteps of Jasperson as he walked over to the rock he had just dropped. Jinbraza, who still hadn't turned around and faced Jasperson, made a desperate lunge for the button that would open the airlock door. The door whisked open, and in one swift movement, he dove inside the airlock and pushed the second button that would shut the door behind him. As it began to close, he turned and saw Jasperson walking quickly towards him. All of his teeth were showing through his goofy smile, but his steps had a sinister, rapid gait. The door closed only seconds before Jasperson got to it. Jinbraza quickly latched a helmet onto his exploration suit and then immediately pushed a third button that began evacuating the air out of the chamber. He was safe. The inside door couldn't be opened once the evacuation procedure had begun. He could hear Jasperson repeatedly slam his fist into the door. The heavy door vibrated with each punch, but it was strong and couldn't break easily. Jinbraza breathed a sigh of relief and went over to examine the runabout. After Jasperson's latest excursion, its batteries were only at a quarter power. That didn't matter. It was enough to get him away from danger. A minute later, the outer airlock door opened and he drove several meters out of the building. He stopped for a moment and looked back at the habitat. Through one of the windows, he could see Jasperson standing in the common room staring back at him. Jasperson waved, smiled, and made a friendly-looking gesture for Jinbraza to return. Jinbraza turned again and drove off towards the horizon, to a spot where he could no longer see the habitat. He stopped and took a moment to assess his situation. He couldn't stay out of the habitat indefinitely. His suit and the runabout would only offer him life support for so long. He would have to think of a way to get back inside, but no ideas came to him. As he sat in the runabout contemplating his fate, he was startled when a large shape passed over him in the sky. He shot a look upwards and immediately recognized the outline. It was the Stardust, and it was headed towards the habitat.
The message,
Jinbraza whispered.
Yasmela.
He shook his head back and forth as he slowly began to realize what the erased message must have said. It had been the Stardust letting them know when it was going to arrive with a replacement for Collins. It was no coincidence that Jasperson had chosen that day to end his game. Jinbrowser turned the runabout around and headed toward the habitat as fast as the vehicle would take him. Yasmila and her crew were all in danger, but he was at least 15 minutes away. As he approached the habitat, he could see the form of the Stardust perched on the landing platform atop the structure. A transport tube which allowed the crew direct access to the inside extended from below the ship. Jinbrowser became more concerned when he saw that all of the habitat lights were out. It was dark inside and out, and only its silhouette showed up against the setting sun and the dusky yellow sky. The darkness indicated either a full electrical failure or that somebody had intentionally powered the habitat down. He pulled up next to the building and carefully stepped from the runabout. Walking with trepidation, he moved up to the window and looked inside. The common room was dimly lit by the setting sun. He could see a small form moving through the room, which he quickly recognized as Bannon, one of the Stardust's crew members. Bannon held a small flashlight in his hand, though most of the light was lost within the cavernous room. Jinbrowser banged his fist against the window, but the solid structure absorbed his blows easily and he went unseen by Bannon. Suddenly, Jinbrowser noticed something else moving within the habitat. Slowly and out of the shadows, the mammoth shape of Jasperson moved up behind Bannon. Jinbrowser tried to scream. He tried to warn the crew member of the danger right behind him. Jasperson, who was only a few steps behind Bannon, turned and looked at Jinbrowser. Even in the dim light, his toothy smile showed bright. In only an instant, the smile dropped from his face and his hand shot out as he grabbed Bannon by the neck, pulling him in. With a quick jerk, he turned Bannon's head all the way around. Bannon's lungs let out one last breath as he died with a surprised look on his face. Jasperson dropped the body to the ground, and apparently not feeling as if he had completed his task, he picked up the large yellow rock and brought it down on Bannon's head. Blood splattered all over the room as the rock smashed into the dead man's skull. Though Jinbrowser couldn't hear what was happening inside, he knew the sound of the slamming rock must have been loud. Two people ran down the stairs from the tech room, and Jinbrowser's heart sank when he recognized Yasmila. Hack, the ship's other crewman, was with her.
Go back!
He screamed uselessly.
Leave!
Jasperson once again disappeared into the shadows. In the near darkness, it took a moment for the two shipmates to register what had happened to Bannon. Yasmila peered closer and closer at the form on the ground. From outside, Jinbrowser could see her turn away in shock as she realized her crewman was dead. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Jinbrowser frantically waving his arms and pointing to the darkened corner in which Jasperson had faded. She turned to look just as Jasperson emerged from the shadows. Taking giant quick steps, he had the rock held high above his head, which he then brought down on Hack's skull, before the crewman even knew what was going on. Hack collapsed from the strike and blood flowed from his nose. He was dead. Yasmila screamed as Jasperson grabbed her by her shirt and pulled her towards him. He paused as if to contemplate his next move. Then he punched her with his big, meaty hand. The force of the blow was sufficient to knock her unconscious, and she fell to the ground as Jasperson loosened his grip on her shirt. With the woman temporarily incapacitated, Jasperson picked up Hack's body and carried it in front of him to the window where Jinbrowser was standing. He smiled and used Hack's limp hand to wave at Jinbrowser. He dropped the body and began laughing uncontrollably. Jinbrowser had seen more than he wanted. With no real plan of action, he got back into the runabout and drove off again over the horizon, feeling thoroughly defeated. Yasmila was still alive, but there was nothing he could do for her at that moment. He stayed away overnight until the sunlight slowly began creeping back over the horizon. After an uncomfortable night spent in the runabout, he accepted that there was no further point in staying away. No plan he could think of would be even remotely successful in saving his life. He would try to reason with Jasperson, maybe even make a bargain for Yasmila's life, but he knew there was virtually no chance of that working. Still, a quick death at Jasperson's hands might actually be preferable to the drawn-out death that awaited him outside the habitat. He turned the runabout around and headed back. On his return approach, he noticed that unexpectedly the stardust was gone. The power to the habitat was still out. He made a circle around the building to make sure that Jasperson wasn't waiting outside in an exploration suit. He saw nothing. He parked the runabout outside the common room window and looked inside. The bodies of Bannon and Hack were on the floor, and blood was everywhere, but there was no sign of Jasperson or Yasmila. With the power out, the door to the airlock wouldn't open for him automatically. He would have to open it manually. Stepping down from the runabout, he reached underneath it and retrieved a large metal crank that could be used in a power failure situation to open the airlock doors. He approached the outer door, but he stopped when he saw something moving in the airlock through the window. It was a person, but it was too small to be Jasperson. It was at that moment that Jinbrazer understood the final move of Jasperson's game. Yasmila was inside the airlock, alive. There was still plenty of air for her, but with the power outage, she had no way of opening the inside door and getting back into the living quarters. The inside door could be manually cranked open too, but it was unlikely that Jasperson had left a crank in there for her. There was no protective suit for her to put on. If Jinbrazer was to get back inside, he'd have to expose Yasmila to the thin, poisonous atmosphere of the awful planet they were on. If he did that, she would be dead in 15 seconds or less. Jinbrazer considered his options. He could survive outside in his suit and the runabout for several more hours. Eventually, his power would run low. His oxygen recycler would stop working, and he would die. Taking into account the size of the airlock and the fact that the life support had been down for several hours, Jinbrazer estimated that Captain Teg had about 25 hours of breathable air left. Then she too would die. I can do nothing, and we both die. I can do something, and only she dies, Jinbrazer reasoned with himself. He made eye contact with Yasmila through the airlock window and held up the crank. He pointed at it and then back at Yasmila. She understood that he was asking, "Do you have one?" She shook her head no. He pressed the palm of his gloved hand up to the window, and on the other side she did the same. He waited hours, hoping that another solution would present itself, but there was no change in the situation. Eventually, the warning lights on his suit came on, and he knew he had to act. He picked up the crank from the surface of the planet. Inside the airlock, Yasmila could see the indicator lights flashing on his suit, and she knew exactly what was happening. "It's the only way," he mouthed to her through the window, though he was saying it to himself as much as he was to her. He saw the momentary panic on her face, but she regained her composure and resolutely nodded her head as if to say,
"It's okay."
They both stared into each other's eyes one final time, and he remembered when he had last held her in his arms. Resigned to the fate that awaited Yasmila, he bent down so that he could stick the end of the crank into the small hole near the bottom of the doorway. Out of the corner of his eye, he could still see Yasmila standing silently in the airlock. He turned away entirely to avoid looking at her again. He took a deep breath and began turning the crank. He saw dust kick up as the door slowly raised and the air shot out into the planet's thin atmosphere. Yasmila was pushed up against the door by the force of the escaping air. As it continued to rise up, Jinbrazer could see her face peek through the widening slit between the door and the ground. Her eyes bulged out, and she had a look of absolute horror pasted over her features. She might have been screaming, but it was also possible that it was simply the air being ripped from her lungs against her will. She thrashed several times before she became still, and as the door continued to rise, her lifeless body rolled outside onto the dusty ground. Jinbrowser cried out in his suit. "Forgive me, Yasmila," he lamented. The moisture fogged the visor of his helmet, but he continued on. The door was high enough for him to crawl under. Once inside, he pulled Yasmila's body back inside. Then he inserted the crank into another square hole and slowly closed the door. He went through the inside door in the same manner. He was no longer afraid of Jasperson. The stardust was gone, and Jasperson was the only possible pilot. In the tech room, he found the battered corpse of a man who he didn't know. Collins's replacement, probably. He carefully stepped over the body to the console and restored power. The habitat systems came back online. Jinbrowser removed his suit and walked down to the common room. Among all the blood and carnage, he saw Jasperson's beaten journal placed in the middle of the table. He sighed, and even while shaking his head as if to say no, he picked up the journal and read the entry that he knew would be waiting for him.
Hello, killer. Did you like that little bit of fun that I left for you? Admit it. You enjoyed it just a tad, didn't you? I have to say, you surprised me by running out like that. I figured a born little thing such as yourself would stick around and try to talk your way out of it. I was really going to enjoy slamming that rock into your head. But as it is, I had a great time killing those others in your place. They could still be alive, you know, all 4 of them. I wasn't planning on that massacre, but with you still running around alive out there, I really had no choice. Or maybe I actually was planning to kill everyone. I'll just leave it for you to figure out which one's the truth. I have to say, Jinbrowser, I've learned a lot about myself these last 2 weeks. I know now that I should embrace who I really am. The funny thing is, I was actually good at this job, probably better than you. Did you know that I found a very valuable outcropping over the Western Plains? It's true, and I'm sure there's more. This planet is probably one of the most valuable resources in this sector. And now, it's all yours. Too bad for the company, though. As far as they're concerned, they'll receive a message from the Stardust that all hands on this planet were lost due to unforeseen seismic activity. Then the Stardust itself will eventually disappear in space. I seriously doubt they'll send another team out here. They've already invested way too much on this valueless rock. And you know how cheap they really are. So it's a new start for both of us. Enjoy your life, Jinbrowser. I'm sure that one day I'll come back and see you. Maybe I'll kill you. Or maybe I'll just say hi. I suppose it would depend on how I feel at the time. Until then, take care, my friend.
Jinbrowser let the book fall to the floor as he contemplated his situation. Jasperson had been right about one thing. The company would not spend any further time or effort on this planet. He would probably be stuck there the rest of his life. The habitat with its food generators and air recyclers could easily keep one man alive indefinitely. But did he really want to live out the rest of his life alone? He looked at the dead bodies around him. Across the room, he noticed the missing parts to the long-range communicator. They were broken and smashed. He fell to his knees. Even for a man who liked solitude, it was too much to bear. And he found himself hoping that one day, Jasperson would indeed come back to visit him. And that was Jasperson's Game by Thomas O. A good reminder not to be so damn nosy. A little about the author. Thomas O. likes dogs, the ocean, and creepy stories. He's the author of 2 books on Amazon published by Velox Books, The Seer of Possibilities and Face Down in the Grave, both available on Amazon, and right around the corner on audible.com. Thanks, Thomas. And do me a favor, would you? Subscribe to this podcast wherever you do your listening and leave me a 5-star review and a kind word, even if you're listening on YouTube. I need soldiers on all fronts to win this battle, and I appreciate it. To hear a premium ad-free edition of tonight's and all our other episodes, visit simplyscarypodcast.com today and click the Patrons link in the menu at the top of the screen. You'll find yourself at chillingtalesdarknights.com, where you can become a patron for as little as $5 per month and get access to our entire audio archive, all ad-free and available to download or stream. Thank you for your time and for supporting our sponsors. When you support our sponsors, you support this show. If you happen to use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, you can follow and subscribe to Chillin' Tales for Dark Nights there, where you'll get all our latest updates and new releases, and have the chance to interact with us each and every week. You'll find me personally on Facebook. And we're accepting submissions, friend. If you've got a story or two you'd like to be featured on this show, send it to drewbloodhorror@gmail.com. If selected, you'll get the full treatment. 10 bananas. Well, I'm afraid this is where we part ways, friend. At least till next week. So grab a drink for the road. November 17th is National Take a Hike Day, you know. So have one on me, and do just that. Hey, I'd like to take a minute to say hi and a big thank you to all my patrons. Y'all know who you are, and each and every one of you have a special place in my heart. If you've ever thought to yourself, hey, I wish I could help old Drew Blood out and help feed Chester a little bit, well, go to patreon.com/DrewBlood and become a patron. Every little bit helps, friend. And just because you're not a patron doesn't mean I don't love you anyway, by God. Hell, I love everybody. Let's all have a big group hug and maybe give each other some loving. I don't know. So may the wind be at your back, and may the road rise up to meet you. And until next time, all together, friends, go fuck yourselves. Good night, y'all.
Chilling tales for dark nights.